Something enormous just happened, and most Americans are only catching the headline without understanding what it actually means. 3 U.S. B-1B Lancer bombers touched down at RAF Fairford in the United Kingdom after what is believed to be the first American strike mission against Iran launched from a British base. Let that land for a second. A NATO ally, our closest ally, just became a launch pad for a war that, weeks ago, its own prime minister said he wanted no part of. Keir Starmer had initially denied Trump's request to use British soil as a staging ground for strikes on Iran. Then, on March 1st, he reversed course. And here's where it gets complicated. The UK is now the first and only European country to openly allow the United States to use its bases in the bombing campaign against Iran. Not France, not Germany, Britain alone. About a dozen B-1 bombers are now at RAF Fairford, which could represent more than half of the U.S. Air Force's entire mission-capable Lancer fleet. This is not a footnote in a conflict. This is a continental power shift happening in real time. And the British public, by the way, strongly opposes it, with only 10% saying they support the military action the U.S. has taken against Iran. So the question America needs to sit with right now is this. When a democratic ally defies its own people to join your war, what does that tell you about how this war is being sold? And to whom? Now you understand the gravity of what's actually unfolding here. Let's go deeper into what this really means, not just for Britain, but for us. Because this is not a story that stops at the shores of the English Channel. Every single ripple from that runway at RAF Fairford in Gloucestershire, England, hits American soil in one form or another, economically, geopolitically, and morally. And that's the story most people are simply not connecting right now. Let's start with the most fundamental question. How did we get here? Because this war didn't begin with bombers. On February 28th, President Trump authorized Operation Epic Fury, a joint U.S.-Israeli military campaign targeting Iran's ballistic missile infrastructure, naval forces, and nuclear program. Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, was confirmed dead by Iranian state media shortly afterward. That happened. In one military operation, the United States and Israel assassinated the supreme leader of Iran, and the world has been on fire ever since. Trump framed the operation as a necessary response to what he called Iran's imminent nuclear threat, saying the U.S. had exhausted diplomatic options after Iran rejected every opportunity to renounce their nuclear ambitions. Whether you believe that framing or not, and there are serious, credible people who deeply question it, the operation launched, the bombs fell, and now we are 14 days into a war that nobody in the American public voted for, in the traditional sense of a congressional declaration. Here's something that should stop you cold. The war has already killed 6 U.S. soldiers and wounded 18 others. American and Israeli strikes have killed hundreds of Iranian civilians, including children, and retaliatory strikes have killed at least 11 Israelis and others across the region. And as of the latest numbers that congressional staffers are now quietly passing around in whispers on Capitol Hill, American and Israeli strikes have killed more than 1,000 people in Iran, according to the Iranian Red Crescent Society. 13 people have died in Israel, and 6 have died in the United Arab Emirates, while 570 people in Lebanon have died, according to the Lebanese Prime Minister's office. Those are not statistics. Those are people, grandparents, children, doctors, teachers, people who woke up on the wrong morning on the wrong side of history. Now back to Britain, because if you want to understand what's happening at RAF Fairford and why it matters enormously for us, you have to understand the trajectory that got Keir Starmer from no to yes. Ahead of the U.S.-Israeli attacks, Trump had requested permission to use 2 British bases, Diego Garcia in the British Indian Ocean Territory and RAF Fairford in Gloucestershire, England, as a staging ground for strikes on Iran, likely to launch stealth B-2 bombers. Starmer denied the request. He denied it. That is important. A sitting British Prime Minister looked at the most powerful man in the world, the President of the United States, and said no. And then, over the following 2 days, Iran launched sustained attacks across the region at countries who did not attack them. Iran hit airports and hotels where British citizens were staying, and Iran hit a military base in Bahrain, narrowly missing British personnel. And that changed the political calculus inside Downing Street almost overnight. Starmer said the basis of his decision was the collective self-defense of long-standing friends and allies and protecting British lives, adding that this was in line with international law. But listen to what legal analysts were saying at the very same moment. Any arrangement allowing U.S. warplanes to operate from British air bases carries significant risks. Iran's missile systems are mobile and launchers are mounted on trucks. From RAF Fairford, U.S. aircraft face flight times of 7 to 9 hours to reach Iranian airspace, necessitating patrol-based missions. Once airborne, pilots may have only minutes to act. The idea that a U.S. crew would pause mid-mission to seek fresh British legal approval is unrealistic. London must rely on Washington's assurance that only agreed categories of defensive targets will be struck. Read that again. Britain is trusting Washington's word in a live war, with bombers in the air, and no mechanism to pull the brake if something goes wrong. And now look at the scale of what this has become. RAF Fairford is the U.S. Air Force's only dedicated forward operating location for heavy bombers in Europe. And right now, it is not just occupied, it is overflowing. About a dozen B-1 bombers are now at RAF Fairford, which could represent more than half of the U.S. Air Force's mission-capable Lancer fleet. All told, as many as 15 bombers are at the base, with 3 B-52 Stratofortresses in addition to the B-1s. 15 strategic bombers at a base in England flying missions against Iran. Let's be honest about how unprecedented that is. During the Cold War, RAF Fairford was a staging ground for theoretical nuclear deterrence. Today, it is a live strike platform in an active war against a country that has ballistic missiles capable of reaching U.S. military assets across the region. There are now 15 American bombers flying strike missions against Iran from RAF Fairford. And the weapons they're carrying have changed in a way that tells you something important about the state of the war. The observed loading of JDAMs aligns with statements from defense officials in Washington that the air campaign has shifted from relying on expensive and less plentiful long-range missiles like the JASSM to relatively cheap and plentiful guided gravity bombs like GBU-31s. That shift from precision cruise missiles fired at a distance to gravity bombs that require flying directly over or near a target tells you something profound. It means the United States military now believes it has enough control of Iranian airspace to fly directly over enemy territory and drop bombs from altitude. Secretary Hegseth said that the U.S. had gained control of Iranian airspace and was shifting from advanced standoff weapons to gravity bombs. That is a staggering escalation from where things stood even a week ago. And here is where you need to think about the money, because this is a war being waged while American families are being told that Medicaid needs to be cut, that SNAP benefits are bloated, that government spending is out of control. The Pentagon estimates that it spent more than $11.3 billion in the first week of Donald Trump's war in Iran, and every cent of that was spent without congressional approval. $11.3 billion in 1 week. The Pentagon used $5.6 billion in advanced munitions in just the first 2 days, and it didn't stop there. The Daily Beast reported that the war has been costing American taxpayers an estimated $1 billion a day, a pace that could push the total bill toward $215 billion if the conflict drags on through September, as some U.S. officials have warned. $215 billion. And the American Congress, the institution that the Constitution explicitly charges with declaring war, has had almost no formal role in any of this. That is not a partisan statement. That is a constitutional fact. Now come back to Britain for a moment, because this is also a story about what power looks like when it is exercised against the explicit will of an entire population. Our survey in late February found 58% of Britons opposed to allowing the U.S. to launch strikes from RAF bases, and subsequent polls on March 2nd and again on March 11th, 12th found that figure still stood at 49 to 50%, even when the missile sites only caveat was included. And just 27% of Britons think America's reasons for attacking Iran are clear, including only 8% who consider them very clear. Think about that. Nearly 3/4 of the British public, the people who live in the country hosting these bombers, cannot understand or do not accept the rationale for this war. And yet those bombers are taking off anyway over their countryside in their name. And then there is the Trump factor, because nothing in geopolitics happens in a vacuum, and Donald Trump has made his feelings about all of this extraordinarily clear. Trump had been petulant, scornful of Starmer for not doing more. This is not Winston Churchill, he told journalists over the Prime Minister's initial reluctance in permitting the use of British bases. Trump publicly mocked the leader of the United States' closest ally, and then, in what can only be described as an extraordinary display of diplomatic whiplash, Trump revealed on social media that the UK was finally giving serious thought to sending 2 aircraft carriers to the Middle East, then said, "We don't need them any longer, but we will remember," adding he had no need for people that join wars after we've already won. So even after Britain bent to the pressure, after Starmer reversed course and opened British soil to this war, Trump publicly humiliated him anyway. That is the relationship. That is the power dynamic we are watching in real time. Meanwhile, what is Trump actually telling the American public about how this ends? Trump hinted the war could soon be over, saying he thinks it's going to be a short-term excursion. But at the same event, Trump gave conflicting remarks, saying the war would end very soon, while also saying that Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's claims that it was only the beginning could also be correct. Both things cannot be true. Either this is a short-term excursion or it is only the beginning. You cannot have it both ways. And the fact that the commander-in-chief is publicly offering both versions of reality in the same conversation tells you everything you need to know about whether there is a coherent strategic plan here. CENTCOM says more than 1,000 targets inside Iran have been struck, using more than 20 different systems across the air, sea, and land, as well as missile defense forces. More than 1,000 targets. And yet, at the same time, senior Israeli officials are reportedly racing to hit as many targets as possible before Trump declares the war over. With Trump hinting that the war could soon be over, Israeli officials are racing to hit as many targets as possible. That is a coalition partner not trusting the American president's timeline. That is allies operating on separate clocks, in the same war, over the same country. And there is something even more unsettling happening at sea. The 20 million barrels of crude oil that usually traverse through the Strait of Hormuz are stuck thanks to an Iranian blockade reinforced by sea mines. The U.S. typically consumes a similar amount of crude oil each day. If the strait doesn't reopen soon, average Americans will end up having to spend a massive chunk of their paycheck on gas, causing a ripple effect that will further hurt the economy. This is not abstract geopolitics. This hits your gas tank. This hits the price of everything you buy at the grocery store that was shipped across the country in a diesel truck. And gas prices are already exceeding $5 a gallon in California. Here is the larger picture that all of this is pointing toward, and it is one that Americans who care about power structures and global shifts need to sit with seriously. Britain, the country that gave us the Magna Carta, that fought 2 world wars with us, that shares our language and our legal traditions and much of our democratic heritage, has been pulled into an active war against its own public's wishes by a combination of genuine security pressure and raw political intimidation from Washington. The British public did not want this. According to polling conducted by More in Common, 74% of UK voters now say that British forces should either have no involvement in the war or that they should merely respond defensively to it. 74%. And yet those bombers are loaded and they are flying. Given this burgeoning list of British military involvement, it is surely only a matter of time, given the prolongation of conflict, for the UK to join the full-blooded effort and hit sites in Iran proper. The pretense to legality will have all but collapsed by that point. That analysis comes not from a fringe outlet, but from serious observers of international law who have spent careers studying exactly these kinds of escalation patterns. And the pattern they are describing is one that Americans have seen before. You absorb a smaller ally into a coalition through pressure, through shared infrastructure, through the inertia of proximity, and then you discover, months or years later, that it was never as limited as anyone said it would be. There is a phrase that keeps echoing through all of this, and it is the word defensive. Starmer approved the use of British bases for what he called a specific and limited defensive purpose. The British Ministry of Defense confirmed U.S. forces were using the base for specific defensive operations to prevent Iran firing missiles into the region. But those B-1B Lancers, capable of carrying approximately 34,000 kilograms of weapons, are not defensive aircraft. They are among the most powerful offensive weapons platforms ever built by human civilization. When you load 2,000-pound bunker-busting bombs onto an aircraft and fly it 7 hours to drop them on a country, you are not playing defense. The language of defense is doing a lot of work in this conflict, more work than it can honestly bear. And what does this mean for America's standing in the world at a moment when that standing was already under extraordinary pressure? The United States entered this war without a congressional declaration, without a clear exit strategy, at a cost of over $11 billion in the first week alone, while simultaneously slashing domestic spending and while its own polling shows serious public ambivalence. A Reuters Ipsos poll found that only 1 in 4 Americans say they support the U.S. strikes on Iran, including just 1 in 4 Republicans who believe Trump has been too willing to use military force. 25% support. This is not a war the American people rallied behind. This is a war that happened to them. And now it is happening to the British people, too, from a base in Gloucestershire under fog and drizzle, while the crews of those enormous bombers take off into the night sky over a continent that, like the populations on both sides of the Atlantic, was never fully asked.